You plan a trip, you go somewhere beautiful, somewhere peaceful, looking for a break, and it's just unbelievable that seeking that kind of tranquility could end in, well, in tragedy, especially somewhere like the Baizaran Meadow near Pahalgam in Jammu and Kashmir. People call it mini Switzerland. It's that stunning.
Yeah. It's known for its beauty.
But on April 22nd, 2025, that beauty was shattered.
It really was a truly brutal intrusion of violence into a place most people associate with peace, with, scenic landscapes. It's a very harsh reminder, isn't it, of the security challenges that are still very much present there.
Absolutely. So today, we're going to try and get a handle on this. We're doing a deep dive into this specific terror attack. We've looked at reports from places like the Indian Express, Al Jazeera, India Today, NDTV, the Economic Times. There's Wikipedia, of course, and even some YouTube transcripts from Times Now Navvat and NDTV.
A pretty wide range of sources to draw from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And our aim here, our sort of mission, is to cut through the noise, the sheer volume of information that comes out after something like this. We want to understand the key events, what happened right afterwards, the response, and maybe most importantly, the bigger picture, the context, the implications.
Right. To provide a comprehensive but hopefully digestible understanding of it all.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, the attack itself. What exactly went down in that meadow on April 22nd?
Okay, so the date was Tuesday, April 22nd, 2025. The location, as you said, Baizaran Meadow, near Pahalgam town in the Anantnag district of J&K. Now, as often happens in these situations, the initial casualty figures were, well, they varied.
Right, the fog of war almost, the confusion.
Exactly. Some early reports mentioned fears of maybe 20 killed, others were saying 26. Tragically, the number that's been confirmed since then is at least 28 civilians killed.
28 people gone. And the way it happened, the details that have come out from witnesses are just stomach-churning. It wasn't random, was it?
No, it seems not. The accounts from survivors strongly suggest, well, a very deliberate, targeted approach. Witnesses reported that the gunmen were actually separating people, or at least identifying them within the tourist group.
How?
Well, several survivors mentioned that women and children seemed to be spared deliberately, but then, very disturbingly, victims were apparently asked their names, and they were forced to try and recite the Kalma, the Islamic Declaration of Faith.
To identify non-Muslims.
Precisely. And there are also these deeply unsettling accounts, reports that the attackers were checking men for circumcisions, again, a crude but effective way they apparently used to distinguish Muslims from non-Muslims.
It implies such a cold, calculated decision to target based purely on religion. It's hard to process.
It is. Extremely disturbing.
And there was one specific account about a man named Falath Pushan from Bengaluru that was particularly horrific.
Yes, that story is incredibly harrowing. Mr. Bhushan from Bengaluru, reports say he was asked his religion, and after identifying himself, he was shot. Repeatedly. For what witnesses described as 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
That's what the reports say. An agonizing length of time. And this happened right in front of his wife and his young son. They were spared, apparently, but forced to witness it.
Unimaginable. His mother-in-law reportedly shared the details later. Just sheer brutality.
Absolutely. And that wasn't the only such account.
No, there were others, right. Someone hearing an attacker say something to a woman.
Yes. A survivor recounted hearing one of the attackers, right after killing a man, turn to his wife and say, "Go tell this to Modi."
A clear political message again. Vile.
It certainly points towards that, yes. And another account describes a father being told to recite an Islamic verse. When he couldn't, he was shot.
These details just paint such a grim, specific picture of the attacker's intent.
They really do. It suggests malice, a clear aim to inflict terror, maximum fear, and send these very specific, chilling messages.
And the weapons. Do we know what they used?
The initial investigation, the probe, suggests they were using M4 carbines and AK-47s.
Military-grade weapons.
Yes, standard assault rifles. Estimates are that around 70 rounds were fired in total, so it suggests they were well armed and prepared for this massacre.
And responsibility. Has anyone claimed it?
Yes. The claim of responsibility came from a group called the Resistance Front, or TRF.
TRF. Are they well known?
They've emerged more prominently in recent years. Intelligence agencies widely believe TRF is essentially an offshoot, or maybe a front, for Lashkar-e-Taiba.
Ah, Lashkar-e-Taiba. That's a name we definitely know. Linked to past attacks and figures like Hafiz Saeed.
Exactly. So the claim connects this attack directly back to those established, long-standing terror networks operating in the region, often with alleged state backing from across the border.
Okay, so Let's focus on the victims now. We know the number, at least 28 killed. Can we break that down a bit more? Who are these people?
Right. The confirmed civilian death toll is at least 28. The majority, 24 of them, were Indian tourists. And they came from all over the country: Karnataka, Kerala, Maharashtra, Odisha, Gujarat, Haryana, West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh. A real cross-section of India.
Just people on holiday visiting Kashmir.
Yes. And tragically, 2 local residents from Jammu and Kashmir were also killed, caught up in the violence in their own home region.
And foreigners too, I believe.
That's right. 2 foreign tourists also lost their lives, one person from Nepal and one from the United Arab Emirates.
It really underscores how indiscriminate this kind of violence is, isn't it? It hits locals, visitors from across India, international tourists, everyone.
It really does. No one is immune when something like this happens in a public space.
And some of the victims held specific positions, making their deaths perhaps even more, well, symbolic in a grim way.
Yes, among the deceased was a young Indian Navy officer, just 26 years old. Reports mentioned he'd gotten married very recently.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Truly. And also, an official from the Intelligence Bureau, the IB, was killed. Apparently, he was also shot right in front of his family.
Another layer of intense personal tragedy.
It adds to the profound shock and grief of the whole event. And beyond the fatalities, we have to remember the injured. At least 20 people were wounded, some of them very seriously.
The human cost is just staggering. Right, let's shift to the immediate response, the aftermath.
Yeah.
What happened in those first critical hours and days?
Well, as you can imagine, the scene itself was one of sheer panic and distress. Eyewitness videos started surfacing.
Always happens now, doesn't it?
It does, and they showed, the chaos, injured people crying out, the terrible sight of bodies lying in the meadow, just awful scenes. Emergency services mobilized pretty quickly. Ambulances arrived. The injured were taken to hospitals, first in Anantnag nearby, and then many were moved to Srinagar.
Some airlifted, I read.
Yes, the most critical cases were airlifted directly to a military hospital in Srinagar for more advanced treatment.
And the security forces. What was their immediate action?
A joint operation was launched right away. Local police, the Indian Army. They cordoned off the area and started a massive search operation.
Looking for the attackers.
Exactly, trying to track them down.
Okay.
They brought in helicopters to help survey the area, the surrounding forests and hills, and parts of Pahalgam were put under a temporary lockdown while this was all unfolding.
Understandable. Now, an attack of this magnitude, targeting tourists, it must have triggered a huge response from the political leadership in India.
Oh, absolutely. Condemnations came fast and strong from the very top. Prime Minister Modi was actually visiting Saudi Arabia at the time.
Right, I remember that.
He immediately denounced it as a heinous act, and he vowed that the perpetrators wouldn't be spared, that they'd face justice.
And the Home Minister?
Home Minister Amit, he cut short his own activities, flew straight to Srinagar. He chaired a high-level security review meeting there, getting briefed, coordinating the response.
And the Defense Minister?
Defense Minister Rajnath Singh also weighed in, assuring the nation that a befitting reply, as he put it, would be given. Strong words.
So, a unified, strong condemnation from the Indian government. What about internationally? How did the world react?
The reaction was pretty widespread and similarly condemnatory. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres put out a strong statement condemning the attack, emphasizing that targeting civilians is just never acceptable.
From the EU as well?
Yes, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, expressed condolences and solidarity with India. And we saw statements from leaders across the globe: Nepal, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Russia. President Putin sent a message. Italy's Prime Minister Meloni, Israel's Netanyahu, Australia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Many, many others condemned the violence and offered condolences.
That's significant global condemnation. Now, given the suspected links of the group TRF to Lashkar-e-Taiba, which has known ties to Pakistan, what was the initial word from Islamabad?
Pakistan's immediate public reaction was denial. They stated they had nothing to do with it.
But Delhi wasn't convinced.
Reports suggest Delhi remains highly skeptical. And frankly, given the history of cross-border terrorism accusations and the known operational bases of groups like Leti in Pakistan, that skepticism isn't surprising.
Right. Now, in the middle of all this horror, you have travelers, tourists, stranded, scared, families desperate for news. What support was put in place for them?
Yeah, that's a crucial aspect. Several airlines like Air India Express and Indigo quickly offered flexibility, free rescheduling or cancellations for anyone booked on flights to or from Srinagar.
That helps.
It does, and Indian Railways arranged a special train service specifically to help passengers get back home from the region. Airports also set up support systems, control rooms, assistance desks, especially to help the families of the victims navigate the awful logistics of the situation.
And financial aid. Was anything announced for the victims' families or the injured?
Yes, the J&K government announced compensation. They pledged 10 lakh, that's 1 million rupees, for the families of each person killed. And then 2 lakh for those seriously injured, and 1 lakh for those with more minor injuries. A gesture of support, obviously, though no money can replace a life.
Of course not. But it's an important gesture.
And as another mark of respect, government employees across Jammu and Kashmir observed a 2-minute silence for the victims.
It's good to hear about these gestures of solidarity. Did the local community react publicly as well?
Yes, they did. There were reports of local residents in Anantnag, near Pahalgam, and also in Baramulla, holding peaceful protests and candlelight marches. They were condemning the attack, showing that this violence doesn't represent them, and expressing solidarity with the victims. That's an important counternarrative.
Absolutely vital. And inevitably, a major investigation must have been launched.
Yes, immediately. The National Investigation Agency, the NIA.
India's main counter-terror agency.
Exactly. They've formally taken over the probe. An NIA team went to the Bizarre Meadows site very quickly to collect forensic evidence, start piecing things together.
And interestingly, wasn't there something else that happened security-wise on the very same day?
Yes, quite significantly. On the same day, April 22nd, the Army reported thwarting an infiltration attempt across the line of control up in the Baramulla district. They stated they killed 2 militants trying to cross over. It just highlights the constant ongoing pressure and security challenges along the Law Sea and within the region. It wasn't an isolated day of violence in a sense.
It really paints a picture of a region on edge. Okay, this attack, horrific as it is, didn't happen in a vacuum, did it? To really grasp its significance, we need to look at the history, the context.
Absolutely. Jammu and Kashmir has had this long, tragic history with terrorism and militancy, especially since the insurgency really took hold back in 1989. And while things have fluctuated, there have been periods of relative calm. There are unfortunately many past incidents that echo this one or show the patterns used by militant groups.
Like the Chittisingpura massacre. That one comes to mind.
Yes, that's a prominent example. March 2000, just before President Bill Clinton's visit to India, 36 Sikh villagers were killed in Chittisingpura. The timing, ahead of a major U.S. presidential visit, was seen by many as a deliberate attempt to grab international headlines, to put Kashmir back on the global agenda at a critical moment.
And there was another one around a U.S. official's visit too, wasn't there?
Yes, the Kaluchak attack in May 2002. Militants attacked an army camp, killing soldiers and their families. That coincided with a visit by Christina Rocca, who was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State at the time.
So this pattern, attacks coinciding with high-profile international visits, it seems almost like a playbook. Is it just coincidence?
It's hard to say definitively it's never a coincidence, but the recurrence is striking, isn't it? It strongly suggests a deliberate strategy by some groups to use these moments of heightened international focus on India to amplify their message, to exert pressure, to, well, make noise about the Kashmir issue on the world stage.
And other major attacks over the years.
Oh, there have been many others that mark this history. The Amarnath Yatra pilgrimages have been targeted multiple times. There was a major bus attack in Riyasi. And even Pahalgam itself isn't new to this. There was an attack on a CRPF camp there back in 2000. And going back further, the kidnapping of Western tourists in 1995, which also centered around Pahalgam.
So a long shadow of
A
violence.
very long shadow. These events really underscore the persistent efforts by militants to disrupt life, create fear, and keep the international spotlight, however grim, on the region.
Now, how does the big political change from 2019 fit into this? The revocation of Jammu and Kashmir's special status, Article 370, and the new domicile rules. Does that play a role here?
It's almost certainly a factor in the background, yes. The scrapping of Article 370 and Article 35A, and then the introduction of new domicile laws. These were huge landscape-altering changes for J&K. The new rules allowed people who weren't previously considered permanent residents to gain domicile certificates, which then gives them rights like buying land, applying for government jobs, things previously reserved.
And that caused friction.
Significant friction and anxiety, yes. Some analysts argue these changes have fueled a sense of alienation or disenfranchisement among parts of the local population, particularly Muslims in the valley. This feeling, whether justified or not in political terms, could potentially create, fertile ground for extremist groups to recruit or find sympathy.
And there were a lot of these certificates issued.
Reports indicated something like over 80,000 domicile certificates were issued in just the first couple of years. That number itself sparked a lot of debate and unease within Kashmir about demographic change and loss of identity.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. Now, looking specifically at this Pahalgam attack,
Yeah.
what do security experts think the immediate strategic goals were? What were they trying to achieve with this particular act?
Well, analysts like C. Uday Bhaskar, a well-known strategic expert, suggest a couple of primary objectives. First, as we touched upon with the historical examples, is to thrust the Kashmir issue back into the global spotlight, especially now with the changed status since 2019 and the significant security presence. The attack certainly generated massive international media coverage, so in that grim sense, that objective might have been met.
And a second objective.
To deliberately raise tensions between India and Pakistan, to destabilize the region further, make dialogue harder, and perhaps force international players to pay more attention or even intervene.
And what about the local impact, especially on the economy? Tourism was starting to look up, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. That's one of the most tragic aspects here, economically speaking. Tourism is so vital for J&K's economy. And 2023, and even the start of 2024, had seen really encouraging numbers, record tourist arrivals, in fact. There was a sense of recovery, of hope.
And this attack could just shatter that.
There are huge fears it will. Targeting tourists and doing it in a prime destination like Pahalgam sends a chilling message. We're already seeing reports, particularly from eastern India, of travel agents getting mass cancellations for Kashmir trips. The worry is that the peak summer season, which so many livelihoods depend on, could be completely derailed. That's years of recovery potentially wiped out.
It's devastating for people trying to rebuild their lives in the local economy. Are there other strategic aims the attackers might have had?
Beyond grabbing headlines and hitting the economy, yes. A broader goal is likely just to disrupt the overall narrative of peace and development that the Indian government has been trying to promote in J&K post-2019. By hitting soft targets like tourists or sometimes non-local workers, they aim to create fear, to discourage people from coming, to undermine that sense of returning normalcy.
And perhaps boost their own side's morale.
That's another angle some analysts like Major Gaurav Arya have put forward. The idea that after a period where things like, say, stone pelting incidents decreased significantly and there was a feeling of greater stability, an attack like this might be intended to show that the militants are still potent, still capable of striking, to, yes, boost the morale of their own cadres and supporters who might have felt sidelined.
So it's complex. It's not just an attack on India, but potentially also aimed at undermining the local Kashmiris who are trying to embrace development and tourism.
I think that's a really important point to make. Many see this type of violence as a direct assault on the aspirations of ordinary Kashmiri people themselves, people who want peace, who want economic opportunities, who benefit from tourism and development projects. By attacking these things, the militants are, in effect, attacking the hopes of the local population for a better, more stable future. They're trying to keep the region locked in conflict and fear because that's the environment where they thrive.
We mentioned the historical pattern with U.S. visits. This attack happened while U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance was visiting India. Is that timing likely significant too?
Again, it's hard to be certain without direct intelligence, but given the history, Clinton, Rocca, the timing is certainly suggestive, isn't it? Having a major attack occur while a high-ranking U.S. official is in the country guarantees significant attention from U.S. media and policymakers. It could be seen as an attempt to ensure the Kashmir situation features in U.S.-India discussions, or simply to embarrass the Indian government during a high-profile visit.
And Prime Minister Modi being in Saudi Arabia at the time, how does that play into the India-Saudi relationship, especially on security?
Well, PM Modi cutting his visit short showed how seriously India took this. It immediately became the top priority. It's almost certain the attack would have been discussed, or will be discussed, between Modi and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. India and Saudi Arabia have actually been building closer security ties recently.
Oh, really? In what areas?
Things like counterterrorism cooperation, sharing intelligence, working against extremism and terror financing, even tackling drug trafficking. So an attack like this, especially with potential links back to networks that operate transnationally, could actually strengthen their resolve to cooperate more closely on these security issues.
Interesting. Now, there was also mention of a statement by Pakistan's army chief shortly before the attack. Is there anything to that?
Yes, there were reports about a statement made by the Pakistani army chief in the preceding days. Some analysts interpreted parts of that statement as being, shall we say, potentially inflammatory or reinforcing a narrative of conflict regarding Kashmir.
Implying a link.
Well, suggesting a potential link is easy, proving it is much harder. While the timing and rhetoric might seem suggestive to some observers, establishing any direct causal connection between that specific statement and the decision to launch the Pahalgam attack would need concrete evidence, which we don't necessarily have publicly available. It's something investigators will likely look at, though.
Right. Correlation isn't causation. Finally, there's the perspective we touched on earlier, the idea that this attack specifically targeted Hindus, reflecting a broader anti-Hindu agenda from Pakistan-backed groups. How valid is that interpretation?
It's a perspective strongly voiced by some commentators and analysts, yes. Figures like Major Gaurav Arya, also Rakesh Sinha, have explicitly argued that Pakistan perceives India primarily as a Hindu state, and therefore deliberately targets Hindus within J&K as part of its strategy.
And the details from the attack scene seem to support that.
The accounts we discussed earlier, asking for names, asking people to recite the Kalma, checking for circumcision, they definitely lend significant weight to the interpretation that there was specific targeting based on religious identity, aimed at non-Muslims, who in the context of tourists from mainland India would predominantly be Hindus.
But it's not the whole story.
Well, it's crucial to acknowledge that horrific element, the religious targeting. But the Kashmir conflict itself is incredibly complex. It has deep political roots, territorial disputes, socioeconomic factors, historical grievances, all interwoven. So while identifying religious targeting as a tactic in this attack is accurate based on reports, reducing the entire motivation solely to anti-Hindu sentiment might oversimplify the very tangled web of political and strategic goals also at play. It's a significant and terrible part of this attack, but the overall conflict has many layers.
Understood. It's a lot to take in. This has been, well, deeply disturbing, but I think a necessary conversation to understand the different facets of this tragedy. Let's try and maybe pull together the main takeaways for everyone listening.
Okay, so first and foremost, the Pahalgam attack was a horrific act of terror resulting in the tragic loss of at least 28 innocent lives, civilians. Second, there's compelling, deeply troubling evidence suggesting victims were deliberately selected based on their religious identity, specifically targeting non-Muslims. Third, the response was swift and strong, both within India from the government and security forces and internationally, with widespread condemnation. Support mechanisms were also quickly activated for those affected.
And the potential fallout.
That's the fourth key point. The potential long-term consequences are really serious for the regional economy, especially the vital tourism sector, which was just recovering, and of course for the already strained relationship between India and Pakistan. It throws fuel on that fire.
And that point about timing, it keeps coming back. The attack happening during significant international visits.
Yes, that disturbing pattern. It forces us to think of the calculation behind it. Who are they trying to influence? What's the message? It seems designed for maximum global impact, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
There's a chilling sort of strategic logic to it, even amidst the brutality.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
recurrence of attacks around these high-profile moments raises really critical questions about the perpetrators' aims and who they see as their primary audience on the world stage.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, perhaps a final thought to leave you, our listener, with. How did this specific act of violence, targeting tourists, people seeking beauty and peace, in a place renowned for exactly that, how does it challenge our basic understanding of conflict today? What does it tell us about the devastating, very real human cost of these larger geopolitical games and tensions?
And maybe building on that, what responsibility falls on the international community, on all of us, really, when we see such blatant, targeted violence against civilians based on who they are or what they believe? How do we effectively address that and work towards some kind of lasting peace in places caught in these cycles?
Powerful questions. We really encourage you to think about these deeper layers, to look beyond the headlines of this tragic event, and consider its broader and very human implications. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.